Okay, so thanks very much for asking me to come and talk today. I'm second choice. Ian Coutts couldn't make it, so I'm a bit taller. He's got probably a little bit more hair than I do. He's a bit older as well, so I'm a bugger, and he's retired. Anyway, so I was asked to talk about risk assessment and kind of how we would carry out a risk assessment in the GB context. But I think that kind of how did we get here? I suppose that's kind of the key thing. From a standing start in 1960, when we picked up 2 pink salmon in GB, 1 in Scotland and 1 in England, we have cumulatively, until 2010, picked up relatively few fish until 2017, and that's been well established. Although they appeared in 1960 in Scotland and England, they didn't appear until 13 years later in Ireland, although there was some anecdotal reports around that sort of time as well. And it's only very recently that they've appeared in Wales and in Northern Ireland. But this rise has been very dramatic. So we've gone over that a 56-year period where we picked up 30 pink salmon in total across Great Britain and Ireland, only occupying 15 separate locations. We moved over the 6-year period between 2017 and 2021 to 373 fish recorded across 42 different systems. That's a massive increase. That's an order of magnitude in terms of numbers of fish. And I would also say there that in terms of those actual numbers of fish, that doesn't include some of the large numbers of pink salmon that were picked up by coastal nets. So for example, in 2017, the Environment Agency calculated there was more than 200 individuals picked up in the Northumbrian nets that don't appear in those records. So the situation is a little bit more perilous than is suggested by those official data, and we'll get on to kind of how accurate some of those data are as we move on. So risk assessments. So the areas in red are places where pink salmon were recorded between 2017 and 2021, and those surrounded in black are those which have an extant risk assessment in place. There isn't a risk assessment in place for France, Germany or Denmark, although there was fish picked up there in all of these years. But up until this point, the numbers of fish picked up in those countries have been relatively small, been very small in fact, and it hasn't merited a risk assessment, I think, in their view. But it certainly may well come their way in future. So from the Great Britain and Ireland perspective, there are 2 risk assessments in place. Ireland and Britain are seen as 2 different separate biogeographical areas insofar as invasive non-native species are concerned. But today I'm really going to talk about the GB one, although I would say that the structure of these risk assessments follow pretty much the same sort of format, and that would include both the British and Irish ones, but also the Norwegian risk assessment. So what does a risk assessment look like? Well, I think that it comes, if you look at it through, is this working? No. Look at it in terms of the kind of a sort of a clock face, if you like. The first thing we want to do is we want to look at the global distribution to see where the animal is native and not native to start off with. It's a good start. Then we also wanted to look at where the distribution was in terms of Great Britain. So to do that, we also want to have access to decent records, to good quality records. That's something that's been discussed earlier on today about the quality of those data and where they're held and how accessible they are. And then we also want to look at the probability of entry, so identifying the pathways in which the fish have actually got here. And then the likelihood of establishment, and that's probably kind of a key one, and that's really where some of the work that Michael has been doing is really kind of fits really quite nicely into that particular element of a risk assessment. But I'll talk about more detail about what a lot of these things actually mean. But once they've established, well, how likely are they to spread? You know, it's very easy to spread from a base, and what might the options be for either containment or eradication of these animals once they arrive. And also the other key part of an impact assessment is what does it actually mean just in terms of its overarching environmental, economic or social aspects, its impacts. But also any good risk assessment should also identify a sort of a path to follow in terms of research. So it must identify where those research gaps are and try and fill them. So this would fit into a wider GB, non-native species strategy. It's recently been refreshed, but the three key pillars of that are prevention, in terms of why don't allow the animal to get there in the first place. If it does get there and it does establish, how might you control it? And then the third and the nuclear option there is about eradication. So what are the options for eradication, if there are any? So this is a slide that has been done to death in all of these pink salmon sort of conferences going forward. We should all be probably pretty much aware of them. I think the key thing I want to get out of this, really, just this particular slide, is about the plasticity of pink salmon. It's been spoken about before. It is a very, very plastic fish. They're all Oncorhynchus gorbicea, but they're all the same species, but they are very, very different in many ways, both genetically in terms of their overall ecology, in terms of their tolerances, their ecological competences. So what have we learned about the GB distribution? And this is a a key thing there. We look at the distribution of pink salmon around these islands. We find that a lot of these early records come from coastal nets. And from the data that we have, which I have to say is not tremendous, we find that coastal nets, when they're picking these fish up, very, very early on in June. But it's towards the end of June that we first start to see a lot of these animals, and then really start to appear around July. And certainly from a spawning perspective, we estimate that they're spawning around mid-July, beyond the 30th of August, and in fact there are some suggestions even into early September in these rivers. Catches are typically limited to the lower reaches of systems, but they're not limited to that. There are situations where we've found them in beyond the main stem of systems. So typically the lower reaches, but not exclusively so. This goes back to another point I made earlier, was about significant under-recording. So just to give an example from the Thurso, the official records from 2021, which appear on the app, which was developed by Fishery Management Scotland, and is a massive improvement on where we were previously, still is an underestimate of the number of fish which were actually in the river. So if we talk to the likes of Alan Youngson, we might have 100 fish recorded for the Thurso, but in actual fact, his estimate is more in the region of sort of 250. So so that's the sort of level of under-recording that might occur. And we also, every year, have records of people or conversations with people who have picked up pink salmon but haven't reported it to anybody in any way, shape or form. There isn't a structured way of doing this, and that's a real problem going forward. Okay, so why are they here? I mean, this is something that was picked up by Henrik earlier on. It was about climate change and why is this all of a sudden happening in 2017 when we've only picked up penny numbers of these things going forward. I think that climate change is probably the obvious candidate, and it's always find it slightly ironic that certainly from an invasive perspective, we tend to think of species moving northward rather than to the south, but that's what's happening here. The second element of that is the following the use of olfactory cues. That may come as a bit of a surprise to some, but there's some suggestion there that in actual fact that the pink salmon may actually follow Atlantics into systems. Whether that's true or whether it's not, I've no idea. Olfactory cues, well, if we look at the lampreys, for example, lampreys don't home to their natal rivers, but what they do is they actually come back in response to chemical cues which are emitted by the amicetes, these juvenile lampreys in the system. So they don't home, but they actually use other cues to get back into to get to systems. Or, as has been mentioned before, is it something to do with river discharge? Is it just the big rivers? Is it something to do with catchment chemistry? We have no idea. Or is it simply just a game of chance? Well, I would probably suggest that isn't the case. These are records of individual visits from 2017 to 2021 across Scotland, and I'm just using this as an example. There are rivers which are visited year or event after event. Typically on the east coast of Scotland, these are large systems, they are large salmon systems. Cumulatively, they account for something like 66% of the Scottish total. They are big systems, and there seems to be a degree of attractiveness of these systems. Why are these systems always returned to? So I think it can be discharged, but I would say that the sort of outlier, if you look at the east coast of Scotland, there would be the Forth, which one of the biggest rivers in Scotland. Yet has, in any year, maybe 1 or 2 records. So it's not routinely visited by pink salmon at all. So we don't really know why they're attracted to these systems, but we should have some sort of clue as to why these systems are consistently invaded. But where are we? We sort of move on there in terms of the likelihood of establishment. There's some key data gaps here, and I think going back to the point when the risk assessment was first written in 2017, we knew next to nothing about pink salmon. Really, at the end of the day, we obviously have all of the fantastic information that is come from Canada over that period. But in terms of their impacts here, we didn't really know a hell of a lot. We didn't know a lot about their ecology. We knew their general life cycle, and we knew a little bit about their diet from other studies, but we didn't know what would happen in a GB context. Very little about their actual interactions, either behavioural, through competition or even predation. One thing we did have a better handle on was genetic integration, because we know there that pink salmon and Atlantic salmon don't interbreed. That's fine. However, there are issues there in terms of overcutting of reds and things. We had to think about from a good invader's perspective, what are the biological attributes which would aid it in terms of its invasion potential. In terms of kind of relatively fast growth, early maturity, and its ecological competence. And its ecological competence is the ability of an animal to survive in a wide range of habitats. I also wanted to look there about its dispersal ability and looking at pathways. Site fidelity has also been an issue which has been mentioned earlier on. Is there a degree of fidelity to natal sites? But really, kind of the key one I think is about plasticity here. And I'm a biologist that works on Arctic char, which was regarded as being the most variable vertebrate on Earth. So monas are incredibly adaptive, and we can see this with pink salmon itself. We've got the odd and even year populations which have got different environmental tolerances or preferences, which can also survive and go through an entire life cycle in fresh water as well. This is something which is very adaptive, and of course there was another mention this morning that some of these smolts don't go to sea as we might have expected them to do, but might hang on a little bit longer, that sort of thing. So there is a degree of plasticity in there that we have to be very much aware of and alive to. So where are we in terms of kind of this invasion life cycle? Well, this is a typical invasion graph. This would apply to pretty much any invasive species, and this is the kind of the key part of it there. I mean, I think that where we would like to be proactive, this really happens at the beginning of an invasion cycle, when the animals are first occur, and then they start to before they actually really start to increase in numbers. And I think that's pretty much where we were from 2016 to 1960 to 2016. Over that almost 60-year period, we were almost in that kind of that very low abundance period. But now things have moved up significantly. Now this is all ramped up since 2017, where we're now, I think, moving into the sort of situation where they're seeing in Norway, where they really have to go forward with the active eradication and control. And this is when it starts to get really expensive, really, really expensive. In terms of their ability to spread, I mean, the figure on the left, that's the world according to a fish. You know, that's these are a fish at sea can travel anywhere as long as it's within its environmental abilities to do so in terms of things like temperature, availability of food, and also, as from an anadromous fish perspective, there also access to habitats where they can go and spawn. So an example here, just put up Scotland as an example. We have 389 salmon rivers in Scotland. I think it's probably safe to assume that if a river is accessible by Atlantic salmon, it's also accessible by a pink salmon. So I think in terms of actually, the opportunities for spread in Scotland, I think that this map kind of says it all. This is where it really is. I don't think there's any system in Scotland which could be immune to invasion by pink salmon. But on to impact. I mean, I think there's two bits of it here. Really, the one I'm going to focus on first is biological impact. So issues such as disease and parasite transfer. Up until now, we've got expertise in the room here have actually looked at this particular issue and using pink salmon and JB. I've not found anything particularly of concern. However, all of these autopsies have been carried out on dead fish, and that can make a little bit of a difference as well. So I'm not entirely cross that one off the list. The second one's about actually we have large numbers of these animals. What does it mean in terms of kind of interactions with salmon? And just latterly, we're just chatting there about crowding and displacement. Something I think which has already been picked up in Norway. The crowding is a particular issue if you want to try and control these animals, because if you try and net some of these animals out, then you're hardly likely to net out your pink salmon and not have any impact on Atlantics. The other thing, of course, from a wider ecological perspective, is displacement of these fish. That Atlantic salmon may occupy these areas for a particular reason. They occupy these deeper pools because they offer protection and all the rest of it. If those animals are forced out of those habitats within rivers because they've been displaced by large numbers of pinks, then does that open them up to higher levels of predation risk, for example? Does it put them in a habitat which is suboptimal to them, where they're exposed to higher risks? The next thing is about nutrient transfer. So we always have these big pictures of large numbers of pink salmon arriving, often thousands and all the rest of it. But notice as a semi-paras animal, obviously these fish are going to die. And when they die, they decompose. And when they decompose, what happens to those nutrients? There can be positive and there can be negative things associated with that. From a positive perspective, this is one of the issues in Scotland is actually about kind of reduced numbers of Atlantic salmon coming back. What does that mean in terms of nutrient transfer, in a natural system? But here, we can have a similar sort of situation where actually this influx of marine-derived nutrients can actually result possibly in improved growth rates for native salmonids, because you're potentially increasing the number of biomass of invertebrate prey and all this sort of stuff, and it goes through that whole sort of cycle. But it can also attract predators as well, and I'm not just talking about mammalian predators here, I'm talking about two-footed predators, people with rods that may want to use pink salmon as an excuse to enter these systems. But there can be some really quite complex things in there that we have to kind of unpick, I think. And I think some of those from a Scottish context are going to be really quite important. I mean, there's that you may wonder what that small clump of things is there. It's my crude attempt at trying to put together a graphic for a freshwater pear mussel. Freshwater pear mussels there actually require low nutrient numbers, low nutrient concentrations, particularly phosphorus. So what would this massive influx of marine-derived nutrients actually mean for things like freshwater pear mussel? Things like that. Also some other things which make seem pretty obvious there is about kind of spawning overlap, spawning habitat overlap. So they spawn in the same sorts of areas as Atlantic salmon and trout. So, would they overcut them and have a problem there? Well, actually, that's not a problem because they spawn before our native salmonids do, so it's probably less likely to be an issue from that perspective. But there may be some overlap with things like sea lamprey, for example, who also spawn in those similar sorts of habitats. I suppose this is a bit sacrilege in an EST workshop there, but there are things beyond salmon that may be impacted here that we also have to consider. In terms of other impacts, these non-biological impacts, from the general public's perspective, there's been quite a lot of work done in these things about the intrinsic value of our biodiversity, and Atlantic salmon falls back into that. Of course, it's one of the key straplines for Atlantic salmon is that it's iconic, it's the king of fish and all this sort of stuff. That sticks with the public, and the potential loss of a key part of our native biodiversity is of a wider concern. It's not just of concern to people who fish for them or manage them or whatever, it's of concern across society. And of course, Scotland's got a reputation for that as well, because it's also cognizant, related to that there, that, if we have salmon there, then our rivers must be clean, and all that sort of stuff, So there's that sort of reputational thing. From an actual fishery perspective, there's potential there for the loss of an angling experience. People who are spending a lot of money going to fish in Scotland don't want to spend their time catching pink salmon, right? And that can lead to a loss of fishery reputation as well. Of course, if there's a loss of reputation, there's fewer people going, there's a loss of revenue. Loss of revenue, jobs get lost, it can have an impact on employment. Of course, there is another beast in the room here as well, and that's people who really don't care about the catch. And some people would say, well, actually, if Atlantic salmon numbers are going through the floor, then actually, can we just catch these fish instead? And in fact, the Norwegian experience is, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's some pressure there for local communities to catch pink salmon, to either use it as employment, to actually as food for humans, or as food for the pet food industry and things like that. So there are some people who are less concerned about it, and I think this isn't a thing which has come to us since 2017. This is a snippet from Trout and Salmon from 1963, where it says there, this is from the Canadian experimental introductions, where it said, if the experiment is successful, it will shift some of the fishing pressure off of the Atlantic salmon. This could assist in the replenishment of the Atlantic salmon runs, which for some years has been in decline. So we're not dealing with kind of issues which haven't been discussed before. These are the key pressures on Atlantic salmon. It does not have its troubles to seek. And I think that although we already have invasive non-natives there is an issue of concern, I think the addition of pink salmon may be something which is, I wouldn't say the straw that broke the camel's back, but it's certainly something which has to be added to the mix in its own right. So the risk assessment finally puts together, identifies some knowledge gaps. And bear in mind, this has come from the 2017 risk assessment. At that time, we didn't have access to the fantastic works that's already been discussed before, earlier today, by the likes of Henrik and Jaakko and Michael. We didn't have access to these things at that time when we were putting this together. But even with that, I think that there are some very identifiable research gaps or gaps in knowledge that we need to fill. And I think what we really need to do is kind of that right-hand column there, which is labelled confidence. What we really need to do is to switch that estimate of a medium confidence in terms of the conclusion to one of high. I think we need to be confident that that's what it is. But there is obviously a lot of these projects that are up there, or all of these gaps, are things which have already been discussed earlier, particularly things like marine ecology, particularly in terms of things like ecosystem functioning, which is a key one. But also, as we move forward, this review of potential control and containment measures, if these populations escalate. And I think that's really what we need to start thinking about very imaginatively. But also be wary of the fact there that in some situations there may not be a solution. So where are we with the risk assessment now, just to start finishing off? These risk assessments are purely advisory. They don't have a statutory role. There's no role in programme for risk assessment review, but it can be revised if significant new information becomes available. I mean, there has been a significant amount of new information since 2017 to the present day, so it may well be that a new risk assessment merits development. These are actually commissioned by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat, which is funded by DEFRA. So they're the kind of key holders of this. In terms of actions and implementation, the risk assessment simply assesses risk. It doesn't identify specific management options, although it does identify areas where our research and data is lacking. But it doesn't identify who should carry that research out. And that's important, and it's particularly problematic in a UK context because we have devolved administrations. So that's a difficult one. And of course, along with that, and this is where the metal hits the floor, is really about funding. You know, who resources all of this? There is no dedicated funding allocated to any of these risk assessment plans, whether it's for pink salmon or any other invasive non-native. So I'm just going to finish off with this last slide, and this last slide is really kind of a bit of a plea. A couple of things that we've spoken about before. Surveillance. If we can't measure it, we can't manage it, I think. And we really need to have a more structured way of recording these animals, where they are and how many there are. And we look at tools such as eDNA. We've done some of that stuff there with the VETA from Marine Scotland here in Scotland. And yeah, that's good, but there's limitations with that. But we need to have something which is much more structured, much more considered, so that we can all sort of sing off the same hymn sheet. And the last one really, and it's reflected in the NASCO resolution, which was discussed a couple of weeks ago, was about better coordination and liaison. There's lots of work going on, lots and lots of work going on. But we need to coordinate this in a much better way. Both the results of these things, but also looking at sort of more cooperation in terms of sample use and all this sort of stuff, and to answer some of these very, very common questions which occur across the board. So that's it. Thank you.